Hello, welcome back! Today we're going to talk about improv and tabletop RPGs. Improv is what you're doing for like 95% of the time while you're running an RPG. It's where you're making stuff up on the go. And more importantly, I want to talk about the yes and rule of improv. Now, if you've read RPGs, especially modern RPGs, or if you have any kind of experience with improv comedy or just improv acting, I guess, is there non-comedy improv? Is that a thing? Is there non-comedy improv? Anyway, you've heard of the yes and rule, which simply put is when your scene partner says something, you ratify that that thing is real, you yes it, and then you add something to it to make it more. There's a couple nuances to this in that I think both improv comedians and role players don't necessarily understand, but we're going to get into that later. Also, if you can hear this rattling going on behind me, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I won't know until I edit this if I can hear the rattling or not. And then people with sharper ears than me are going to hear things that I won't. Although I know my mic can hear it. I'm looking at it. Yeah, this is just a haunted video. I think the comparison between improv and tabletop RPGs is apt because they are very similar things, but they are not the same things. And this is where I want to talk about the advantages of tabletop RPGs, because I don't think we always appreciate how powerful it is to have an improviser, the dungeon master, who can say no. There are actually two authorities that you should recognize when you're talking about improv and RPGs. The game master can say no, and the dice can say no. Listen to me. Hear me now. The dice can say no. We're going to get to them in a second. But first, let's talk about game masters, because the game master has, in general, a strong and righteous and good impulse where they want to help their players accomplish the things that they're trying to accomplish. But here's the thing. You are robbing your players if you always agree with them, if you always make their stuff work. And this is where the nuance of yes and sort of comes in. Yes and doesn't mean I agree with you. Let me give an example for this. If your scene partner says, hey, I got a gun, let's go rob a bank. Yes and doesn't necessarily mean, although it could mean, but it doesn't necessarily mean, yeah, man, sounds great, let's go rob that bank. But what would be wrong is if you say, that's not a gun, that's a bowl of pudding. So I can still yes and this offer by saying, oh man, instead of the bank, what if we take that gun and go hunting, because we already robbed a bank last week. So I'm acknowledging that what my scene partner said is part of the reality of the world. I'm not denying it. It's the curse of the cheap laugh in improv. But you know what? That's not what we're talking about. Dungeons and Dragons is full of cheap laughs. That's fine. That's fine. The dynamic gets a little bit weirder when you've got a game master talking to a player, because the game master actually does have the authority to say, that's not a gun, that's a bowl of pudding. But be careful with that, because you still want to help the players feel like they are contributing members of the reality that you've built in your setting. So be very, very careful when you deny something the player says. There are a couple instances that sort of align with player motivations that I think we should bring to light here, that we should talk about a little bit. There is, of course, the rule of cool. If the player has a cool idea and you have the ability to bring it to light, you should strongly consider doing so. We talked about this in the analysis triangle video. Narrativist players are going to move toward the cool thing, and frankly, everyone's going to move toward the cool thing. They're just going to have different definitions of what the cool thing is. Similarly, you should cede your authority to the players when they make an argument that the thing they're arguing for is more realistic and it doesn't otherwise mess everything else up. And so this is a good example if they're talking about like, oh, I built a weird water trap Rube Goldberg machine thing. Again, we're talking about simulationist players, right? Players who want the reality of the setting to adhere to a reality they understand. You should strongly consider ceding in those instances. And then finally, you should strongly, strongly consider ceding to the rule book. I didn't list that as an authority because the rulebook has a weird relationship with players and GMs, where the rulebook, I think, starts as a base understanding of how the universe works, but then GMs and players can then negotiate on those. So the rulebook is the opening offer on how the game works, and then you can negotiate from there. So For example, if your paladin wanted to smite and you say, no, you have to choose to smite before you see the result of your d20 roll, your paladin can and should feel cheated by you, because that is not what the rulebook said. However, if you started your campaign with a session 0 and you said, hey, in this campaign, I really think smite is broken on paladins, we're gonna take away the only thing that makes paladins get out of bed in the morning. Come on, don't do that. But you get what I'm saying. The rulebook is malleable, but make sure you understand why paladins are allowed to choose after seeing the result of their d20 roll before you mess with it. That's its own video. Homebrewing is its own thing. Something that drives me a little bit bonkers is when you say no to your players, make sure that you dig a little bit first to find the intent of what they're saying. Something I've seen in a couple of rulebooks is the idea of yes and, yes but, no and, no but. And that's fine. I think people who understand basic narrative ideas sort of intuitively understand that you've got 4 options like that anytime the player makes an offer. But I think what's more important is just here's a general rule of thumb. Here's it's slightly unrelated to what we're talking about in this video, but if your player does something stupid, right? If they declare an objectively stupid action, it's because you didn't describe the situation correctly. 100% of the time, if the players are doing something against their own stated interest, it is because the GM did not describe the situation well enough. When GMs tell stories of their players doing something stupid, I just hear GMs telling on themselves. Come on, guys. The way you fix this, the player says, okay, I want to jump the gap. The bad GM response is like, okay, roll athletics, or whatever they roll. Oh, you fall in the gap, which was 50 feet wide, you moron. And you get on Facebook, my player's so stupid. Yeah, but what you leave out of the story is when you described it, you said, there's a small gap in the terrain ahead of you. I mean, come on. And so the correct response is you're aware that the gap is 50 feet wide and you have no realistic chance of jumping it. Then the player can say, well, actually, I brought a magic pogo stick. Or more likely to say, oh, I thought it was 4 feet. And now you haven't set up this antagonistic relationship with the player where you set up these gotchas, even though the GM has all the power in the universe. Like, it's... We'll talk about gaming by consent later, because that is, you could argue that that's not the case, but the power dynamic between game master and player is massive. And so there's nothing stopping you from game master saying, your characters all die because you're stupid. And according to the kind of social contract of the game, which again, we'll can of worms that, talk about it later, that's happened. The characters have died. And so there's no pride. There's nothing to be proud of when your players do something stupid and get themselves killed, unless the players are in on the joke. So if he says, I know it's 50 feet and I'm going to try and jump it anyway. Proceed. Then go to Facebook. Then tell people, yes, my player knowingly tried to jump 50-foot gap. But seriously, whenever you see these stories of GMs telling how dumb their players are, they're telling on themselves, guys. I want to talk about a couple more exceptions to when you want to give players authority over the world. First, I was showing D&D, actually it was to an improv comedian, and it was her first time ever playing. She was not familiar with the concept, and she said, I don't remember what action she was taking, but she had her character say something, and then she dictated the innkeeper's response to her, my NPC. She dictated his response. And while that is interesting in its way, that breaks the understanding, the social contract of D&D. And so I just generally pointed out, well, you actually don't get to control the innkeeper's response. They are under my purview. However, I think there is wiggle room in here. I think the player could say, okay, I tell the innkeep, I'll only give you 3 gold coins, and I think it would be really cool if they had a dog or something attack me as a result. Good example. This is why I should definitely think of my examples before I start the video. Additionally, you'll see systems. Fantasy Flight Star Wars has something like this. Come on, there's one on the tip of my head. We've got these plot points, like a resource that the characters can spend to alter something about the world. Like, the general understanding is the player controls their character and has effectively absolute authority over their character. Most of the time. Charisma checks. Most of the time. And then the GM has authority over everything else in the world. But games have been experimenting, actually for some time, with breaking away from that formula, especially when you see GM-less systems. They tend to work this way. And then there's actually something in the 4th edition, which may as well be the mascot of this channel, where they talked about how his son was playing with him, and he said, off in the distance I see a tower, I go there, I kill the lich, I get some treasure. And that's crazy. I wouldn't really let my players do that under any circumstances. But he said, you know, consider doing this. Consider doing this. And that's there. You'll sometimes see like abilities or feats or resources where the player can say, "Oh, I remembered to bring an extra thermal detonator." Haha. And it's kind of interacting with this weird zone where the player can actually alter the narrative, but usually the understanding is they're altering the narrative in a way that their character conceivably could have. I'm kind of getting out into the weeds on this one. I think this might have to be its own video. But the point is, consider very limited forays into letting the players have authority over the world outside their characters. Let's talk about them gall-darn dice. Let's talk about the dice. Here's the thing. Most GMs I talk to believe that the dice are beholden to them. And to an extent, I think that's true. But almost all of the time, that should not be true. If you're rolling the dice and you don't accept the outcome of them, why did you roll them? I accept 2 possible answers. 1, you want to bluff the player about something being possible or impossible. That's fine. 2, you just want to scare the players that you're rolling dice for some reason. Those are the only 2 reasons I can think of why a good GM would be rolling dice without caring about the result on the dice. Other than that, we came here to play a game, not hear you tell us a short story that you wrote about our characters. And so if the dice kill a character, they kill that character. Also, if you're cheating the dice to hurt the players, you're not cut out for GMing. Stop it. Stop it. I have probably angered so many of you. So many of you. The narrativists, I might call you. So it might be worthwhile to get together in session 0 and just ask your players honestly, do you want the dice to be able to kill your characters? And do you want me to overrule the dice when I think they don't serve the story? I think you'll be surprised how often your players say no, they don't want you to overrule the dice. Because we came here to play a game that has rules. And if you're just going to decide when our characters live or die, then we're not playing a game anymore. We're listening to you tell a story. I think it's easy as a game master to vastly overestimate how much players want their characters to be protected from the winds of fate, right? Obviously, players can grow very attached to their characters, and they can be very disappointed when their characters die. But if you demonstrate to the players, even in a small way, that the chance of their character dying is slim to nothing, then you have destroyed that character's ability to be a hero. If there's no chance of failure, there's no glory in victory. Don't fudge your dice. Seriously, don't fudge your dice. Don't do it. The dice are there because they are an authority that can tell the players no and can tell you no. You get to decide. It's like this separation of powers thing, right? Where you get to decide when the dice get to be relevant, but once you've said these dice are relevant, they have to be relevant. If they're irrelevant, you've made a mistake, with the 2 exceptions I mentioned earlier. So this is my challenge to you. This is my homework that I'm going to give you. Stop fudging dice. Stop it. Stop it. Kevin, what about fudging hit points on monsters? I really don't think you should. But that's a slightly different question. We'll talk about that later. Anyway, I hope this was helpful in how improv can apply to your GMing. Moreover, I hope this was helpful in showing how tabletop RPGs and improv are not the same thing. How tabletop RPGs, I would argue, have an advantage over improv because they have a game master and they have dice. Anyway, I love you. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye!